Welcome to a Tosa Talks, Building a Diverse, Thriving Community discussion. We are in an ongoing Facebook Live series, proudly sponsored by our generous friends at Bostic. Tosa Talks features 3 monthly presentations designed to provide meaningful discussions around racial and social justice issues to support the work of building an inclusive, anti-racist community. Tonight's talk features a discussion with local author, pastor, and anti-racist activist, Dr. Shon Lewis. We welcome and encourage you to take part in the live question and answer session tonight. Please be a part of the conversation by adding your questions and comments for our speaker into the Facebook comment section during the presentation. And now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's host, Robin Luther.
Hi, everybody. We're so glad to be here tonight for discussion with community wellness leader, Dr. Shon Lewis. Let me give you a little background before we start. Hi, Dr. Shon Lewis. How are you?
I am great. How are you?
I am fine. I want to read a little bit about you so we can introduce you to our viewers. Dr. Lewis was born and raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, like many of us. As a young child, she attended Golda Meir School, Milwaukee's multicultural school for gifted and talented students. And it was there that she first began to develop her interest in the value and the importance of community diversity. Over time, Dr. Shon has pursued her doctorate in theology, became a prolific author, writing and publishing multiple books, and later an anti-discrimination activist and community leader affiliated with MICA, and also a wellness life coach. Dr. Lewis dedicates herself to supporting good mental health and social equality for all people. How nice to have you here with us.
Thank you. I'm so honored to have you guys invite me on your program, and I appreciate the opportunity.
We're really happy to have you here, and I appreciate your interactions with Tosa Together over the last year too. You've been a great follower of ours, and we've been watching your work out in the community as well.
Thank you.
Why don't we just start off by talking about a little bit of the things in your biography. You went to Golda Meir. You must have been a precocious young woman. Tell us about young Dr. Lewis and what your experiences was like as a child, and when you first realized your interest in diversity and your awareness of racial issues.
Yes, well, it was in the 80s, the early 80s. I was in 2nd grade, and I was very good with reading and writing. So La Follette was actually the elementary school in Milwaukee that I started at. And my teacher, I was a teacher's pet. I didn't try to be, but I was very shy. And my teacher was intrigued by my reading and my writing. And so I got transferred to Golda Meir. And that experience changed me, because when I got there, there was all different races there. So I pretty much came out of an African-American predominantly school to all different cultures. And right away, I was able to communicate with all cultures. It gave me understanding of how to deal with different children, because I was only 8 years old at that age. My best friends became Caucasian at the time, and that's when I was introduced to diversity and where my writing skills developed. And so from that, part of my life, I just began to understand that I was different than other people based on my skin color. And I didn't understand racism until, of course, I got into high school and things like that. But I never experienced that at Golda Meir. Golda Meir welcomed all cultures. My teacher that really impacted me was a Caucasian. And she was like, "You're going to be great. You're going to be a great author someday." And so it happened. And she was a different color than me. So it was a great jumpstart for me. And so that's part of that story as far as my education as a young girl.
That's interesting. So at a very young age, you became quickly aware that there were people coming from all different cultures, all different looks, all different life experiences. How did you feel like you fit into that puzzle?
weird at first because the dialect was different. And so I actually tried to fit in with speaking more, in that way. But I was able to integrate my own identity with my own speaking. But one thing that was beneficial was I was able to learn more articulate communication. So I didn't use a lot of slang and all of that type of stuff. Um, my dad, who really encouraged me to get into the school, he really encouraged me not to fear anyone at a young age because he worked well himself with diverse people, and he was favored by a lot of Caucasian businessmen. And so he gave me wisdom and taught me always respect other people, no matter what their race is, and don't be afraid to look people in their eyes. So that's
Mhm.
one thing that I always carried with me, even though I knew I was different. So
It's an interesting thing to hear you talk about knowing you were different and wanting to fit in. Did that seem strange to you at the time, or looking back on it, does it feel strange that you were the person that had to fit in as opposed to other people fitting into your culture?
it was weird for me at first, probably the first year I was there because that school was just a 3-year school. And
Mhm.
so it was just, a lot of mostly Caucasian people there. But the cool thing about it was there was no racism. I didn't really recognize racism until I got more so into my adult years. Um, that school really was very good about diversity. And so that helped me to be diverse. I really think as a young child that impacted me. I think it was just culture shock at first when I first got there. But then, like I said, after the first year, I was fine because they had the foundation of teaching diversity versus other schools that didn't. So, yeah,
Do you
that was one of the
recall
good things.
do you recall teachers at that young age like openly discussing with you and your classmates the fact that you were from different races and different backgrounds? Did you have those discussions, or did you navigate that on your own, and the diversity was, or the acceptance was more that everyone was there living a similar school experience? Or was that something that was actively discussed when you were in school? Do you recall?
It wasn't discussed. That was what was interesting. I saw more of we're all the same. So I saw more equality. Um, we had a lot of field trips that welcomed diversity. So it was like an unspoken thing. So I really just navigated through it. Um, I didn't really experience racism until I became an adult. So
Okay.
that's when it became challenging for me. And as you and I spoke before this meeting, the gender discrimination as well. That's when I really started recognizing. I think as the 90s kind of came into play, early 2000, that's when it started getting difficult.
Okay. So when you moved
Especially when I got
out
into
of
corporate.
a very diverse school setting and into more,
A war zone.
oh,
That's what it
you
felt like.
described it as a war zone. And
Yeah.
how did you preserve like that transition from being a younger student into a high school student and into young adulthood? Um, you must have had some big life changes then. So you were suddenly experiencing different kinds of things that you hadn't been aware of in grade school. Um,
Yeah.
Before we go into that, you mentioned that your dad gave you something when you were a child that made a big impact on you. Can you
Yeah.
tell the viewers about that? Because I think this is really interesting.
Yes. So during the time I was at Golden My Year, from
Mhm.
8 years old up until 10, that was a time period where a lot of African American dolls were not common. And so I was getting every Christmas Caucasian Barbie dolls. But this particular season in my life, my dad, which I still have this doll, bought me this doll in the 80s. Her name is Peaches and Cream, and she has a butterfly on her belt, and butterflies symbolize freedom and liberty to me. I didn't know subliminally at the time that I would love butterflies. I actually have a butterfly necklace on now that my husband bought me. But I had this doll since I was 9. And the significance of her is she looked like me, or what I aspired to be, because internally, after leaving school, and when I would have my playtime with my dolls, when I had the Caucasian dolls, I didn't understand why they didn't have dolls like me, that looked like me, until he bought that doll. And so I held on to her, as you all can see, all the way until this timeline. And so it's very important that when you're raising children and you're, teaching them diversity, that you're careful with how you purchase even toys or present movies to them. Even like the Disney movie didn't have a African-American princess for many years. And so if you could relate to that, The Princess and the Frog. And so it was like an epiphany for me, like as a kid, like, wow, I finally got a black doll. I love my white dolls, but it was like I felt like I mattered when I got that black doll, and I didn't know what impact me as an adult. And every season of my life, from teenage, I was emerging from childhood to teenager to adult years, to being a corporate businesswoman, to eventually becoming a doctor of theology and divinity. I didn't know that I would hold on to this doll. And so it represents me feeling, significance as an African-American woman, and me fighting the stigma of, there's only just white dolls, and white dolls are the only dolls that matter. That was my mindset at first as a kid, until I saw this black doll my dad bought me.
So that representation was really important. That obviously made a big impression on you.
It did.
Yeah.
But again, I still value every culture, even until now. But because culture during the 80s in the toy industry, they did not have a lot of African-American dolls. And when my dad said, when he saw it, the doll that I just showed, he's like, I got to get this for my baby girl. And so you can imagine how ecstatic I was. And I'm like, I'm holding on to this forever. And so I still have it.
Did you have the advantage as a school in school of having that representation given to you in the form of teachers? You said that your most influential teacher was Caucasian. Were there African-American teachers that you could see, role models in that arena, that you could think that looks like me, that looks like me, or was that a rare?
Honestly, no, I did not see. When I think back, I did not see any African-American teachers there. When I transferred from Golda Meir to Samuel Morris Middle School, at the time was the transition school. It was still for gifted and talented, but it was a middle school. That was my first time actually seeing, the principal was Black. That was my first time seeing an African-American principal. So she kind of reminded me of like a Oprah, because she kind of looked like her. And I was like, wow, I never had a Black teacher that I could recall. And I go into middle school, which is like the kind of like the prime transition of your life before you go into adult years. And I'm like, wow, the principal is African-American. And so that began to make me feel a little bit more comfortable. And so, yeah, that was interesting. Even my teacher, my piano teacher at Golda Meir, she was Caucasian, and her last name was Brown. And the significance of that is that's my maiden name. So I was processing that as a child. I'm like, how is this lady Caucasian and she has the same last name as me? I could never figure that out. Like Charlie Brown, the cartoon Charlie Brown.
Right, right.
So I always wondered, of course, I figured it out later that different people can have different last names of different genders and cultures. But at the time, I could not figure out, how is this lady who's different color than me, how does she have the same last name as me? Because at the time, that was my maiden name, Brown. So
well, it's interesting to jump into your life as a child, and then to know that as you grew older, and you can go back to this, but you said you went into high school and young adulthood, and you suddenly became much more aware of racism and discrimination, and you had some personal experiences that defined that. And then as your career advanced, you became very interested in mental health and
Yes,
how racism is actually impacts mental health in a big
it
way.
does. It
Yes.
does.
Talk about the transition into that awareness and your first realizations of like racism being present for you, either personally facing it or finding it systemically in larger organizations, education or politics or business,
Mhm,
and healthcare and you know, career growth, and
mhm.
how you suddenly became aware of the idea of how racism affected you, not just in the moment, but could have long-lasting effects emotionally and possibly physically on your
Mhm.
well-being.
Yes, so I really began to recognize racism, I would say in my early 20s, but I really didn't have direct racism until 2018, when I went to a specific library, I won't say the name, and the librarian was Caucasian. Um, one particular library, was two different libraries. One librarian literally said to me, because at first I had an honorary doctorate, and then eventually I received my earned doctorate. But when I had the honorary, she's like, "Why do you have?" And this was just so discriminatory to me. Why are you putting that you're a doctor? You just have an honorary. And I'm looking at her like, "You're a librarian talking to me about this?" I think that's very unprofessional. So that was just a few years ago. And then fast forwarding, so that kind of, was like, that took me back. And then the case where I actually had to, take legal measures was when I was trying to do a community wellness event. And this particular librarian would not service me. She kept blowing me off, because of my color, because it was not in the local Milwaukee area. It was a suburban area, and there wasn't many patrons like me, my color. And so after 3 or 5 encounters with her, just don't not wanting to be bothered, I felt like I was Rosa Parks. Because Rosa Parks went through that when she wanted to vote, if you know the story, she kept being turned away, in her personal story. And long story short, I just took legal measures. I didn't, address this person, in any negative way. And Equal Rights, heard my story, and there was some legal action taken. And it was recognized. I received a letter of apology from the library director, and also, supposedly from her. And she's still working at the library. As I said, I won't say what library it's not in Milwaukee. And they put one of my books, The Weapons of the Mind, in there as a compensation. And so I was able to also initiate permanently employee discrimination training. So that was something that was put in the books, um, that I initiated and advocated for. And that's what really got me now actively into anti-discrimination. The mental piece, part of that mental health piece, is that did weigh on me, because when a person goes through that rejection and like you don't matter, it will work on your self-esteem. I mean, obviously it didn't like hurt me to the point where it made me feel, like I didn't matter, but for other people who don't have, certain support systems, or who are not faith-based, that's a huge part of what has helped me. Spiritual care, if you don't have certain foundations, it will cause mental health issues because you feel rejected and like you don't matter.
Mhm, mhm.
So,
So
yeah.
um, that was a specific instance of racism, and which was just in your face, and then you moved through it by being very proactive and saying what you needed in that situation.
Yeah.
What could you say about like racism that appears in the forms of like microaggressions, like just daily, constant, small things that are either purposeful or inadvertent on people's parts that that expose a lot of bias, and there's sort of a constant exposure to small aggressive acts based on race, and how that affects mental health.
Well, I think two common ones that a lot of African Americans go through, especially women, is the hair thing. I wear a lot of wigs. Here is one of my books, The Wonder Wig. This is another piece I wanted to talk about later because it has diverse faces on there. And it talks about the character in there, talks about how she feels insecure because she wants her hair to be long like a Caucasian person. Now, this is my hair. I mean, for African Americans, this is huge. Like, how long is your hair? That's always been kind of like a microaggression thing when we're talking to another race. And sometimes people think because we're wearing wigs as African Americans, some Caucasian women have said to me and people that I know that are African American, is that your hair? They're like touching all on your hair. And it's like, you can't do that. And sometimes they'll assume you don't have a lot of hair because you have a wig on. But in my culture, we just like to change up our hair, whether our hair is long or short. So I asked my husband before I got on the video, should I put on a wig? I mean, that's just our culture. That's what we do. And so when we have another race coming to us and touching all on our hair, not, intentionally trying to be negative, but it's like a boundary issue. If they're not aware that you can't do that with African American women, or if you make a statement that's kind of indirect, like, is that a wig you got on? It's like, excuse me, to us, whatever we are wearing on our hair is considered our hair. And so that's one, sensitive area. The other one is when we go into stores, being followed around, just this happens more with African American men, but also Black, brown-skinned women versus light-skinned. Light-skinned women, Black women aren't treated, as negatively as African American women in corporate. I've actually seen those. Like, they're looked at more as you're closer to Caucasian, so we're going to treat you better. So I've been through that before too, and I've seen that in other corporate situations with Black men. So I don't like that. I don't think that's cool. I've been to Canada before many years ago, and in Canada, they have people that are darker than me, and they're not even African American, they're Indian. And so it's like, even their culture is, kind of, if a person assumes they're Black, they kind of treat them differently. Like, hello, did you hear me? Did you hear me? Just certain dialect, like you're hard of hearing, or, little things like that. It's kind of insulting, but you have to be intelligent enough to just be like, look, I can hear you. I understood what you said, and please don't touch my hair. If you want to compliment me, that's great, but don't start touching all on my hair. Trying to see if it's a wig or not,
Yeah, as an adult, I mean, you recognize these microaggressions, and it sounds like as a young girl, because of where you were in school and your inclination you talked about feeling like you were the person that was different. Are you recognizing backwards? Are you recognizing microaggressions that you experienced as a child that you may not have known what those, how to define those at the time, but that were affecting you coming up through school and as a young adult, before you had that kind of epiphany of like, oh, these are racist activities. The things that you weren't defining is that, does that influence how you feel looking back on your school experiences?
To me, they're separate, honestly, because there was nothing negative about Golda Meir. There was nothing negative about how they treated the students. It felt like I was in Netherland there. I literally felt like, and I think because I felt the best of acceptance, once I got into the war zone in corporate and saw how different that was than my childhood experience, I think it was another culture shock, and it did start affecting me mentally. But again, I have ways of coping with that. I have spiritual care, I have support system, healthy friends and stuff, and
Mhm.
support groups and things like that that help you, which is very good for mental health, that helps you, value who you are. Um, if you don't have that, it will affect your mental health. It will cause depression. It will cause people to feel suicidal. And so it's very important that people are aware that when you mistreat African Americans or Caucasians or Asians, if you kind of make fun of their language, and you and I talked about this too, Ms. Robin, discriminating, against a person's gender, that type of stuff can weigh on you if you're constantly being rejected, and you're constantly being made to feel like you don't matter. And so a lot of people are in mental hospitals because they just feel worthless. And so we want to bring resolution to that. We want to empower people. You matter. You were created to be who you are, to look how you are. And you need to see the value in yourself, see what makes you happy, see the strengths that are in you. And those are the type of inspirations and people that I was around that helped me stay afloat, even though I did have some mental health struggles, but it wasn't chronic or severe enough to put me into depression. But as I said, there's other cases where people are mistreated so badly, especially if they're darker than me. And actually, like, there's times where I can wear my hair in an afro. I can switch it up like that. And sometimes I'm treated differently. That's a microaggression if my hair is in an afro versus straight, because my hair like this is considered the Caucasian look, even though in my mind, I don't consider it that. But just different things I've heard growing up as I got older. If you wear your hair flat, it's more acceptable to society versus if you wear your hair in twisties so I switch it up because I like the diverse looks.
Mhm.
But that is another microaggression that a lot of African American women go through, and men, if they have braids in their hair or an afro, they're treated differently when they're going for jobs. And we've heard some things in the public eye about how we've had cases of people discriminating if they have braids in their hair. It's just a braid. I mean, you know what I mean?
Right, right.
So it's not their
it seems like
character.
for you to start experiencing like your library story, do you
Yes.
think that your childhood, that it sounded like you had a very strong sense of
Yes.
self-worth and
Yes.
self-value, even though
I
you
have.
were experiencing
Especially from my dad. I'm a daddy's girl, and he really made me feel like a princess.
does
And he's
that
still
does that
there.
empower you more to speak up for what you need and to
Yes,
call people
because
out on
it does.
discriminatory practices?
Absolutely, because he empowered me, my dad, who's still alive. He empowered me not to be afraid of anybody, even if they look different than you. And he also empowered me to work with other cultures, because um, other cultures, all cultures are not bad just because there's a few people that are prejudiced and a few people, that don't like you. He taught me that there's good in all culture. And so he always told me, don't be afraid to look people in their eye, and be confident in who you are. And he is and still is a good businessman. And I saw the favor on his life dealing with corporate and business. More people, Caucasian people, loved him than our own race in some cases. he was celebrated because he had wisdom on how to deal with different cultures, and he showed people that they mattered, no matter what your skin color was. So that impacted me. So the negativity that I experienced with the library, that one particular library, and that I see now as an adult Black woman, this is just worldwide, racism and discrimination. And even, like I said, the gender thing, where as women, we are kind of treated differently, even though we're different skin tones, we're treated differently based on corporate positions and things like that, and corporate pay. So that's another layer of issues I have to deal with.
Right, there's an intersection there of discriminatory practices.
Yes, like, some men get recognized in community work or, in corporate faster than a woman, because some people are still living in the 1950s and they're not looking at where women watch us roar. That's kind of like
Right.
the era we're in.
Right.
I'm women watch me roar. So we've been liberated because we're in a different generation. And some men still want to see us with a scarf on our head and in the kitchen. But we've been liberated. And so I think it's definitely generational. That's another thing I've noticed, that some mindsets with different racism is generational. The older
Okay.
generation, I think, are a little bit more racist than our generation. There isn't a racial sensitivity to our generation like there should be. So,
Dr. Lewis, we have a question. Somebody is asking, they're talking about your books that you mentioned. While you're answering that, I have to check my computer battery so I don't blank out on you.
I think I just heard something deep.
That might have been me. I just got a little warning on my computer, so I'm going to check that. So you might see me move around for a second. But
Sure.
they wanted to know a little bit more about who your audience is for your books. Can you give a couple examples of, like you talked about your wig book, and I know
Yes.
you have many, many other books. Can you tell us first, when you started writing, who you're writing for, who that audience is, and what compels you to write so many books? And I will return. I'm listening, but I have to find my battery quick.
No problem. Sure. So my audience is people that struggle with identity issues, that need, peace of mind, people that are seekers regarding spiritual matters, people that have been rejected and need healing mentally. I am very drawn to that because I have had my own journey of healing from racism, other, personal matters that I've gone through with, being, attacked, by criminals. And of course, like I said, just some corporate stuff that I saw when I was younger, corporate challenges based on my gender. So the Wonder Wig, this book right here, was just released right before New Year's. And this book is based on a story of a young girl who struggled with identity issues, because that's something I can relate to in regards to the hair when I was younger. And the audience is generally for people who need to find themselves. They need to, this is a popular term that I started using recently, know yourself. You need to know yourself, and you need to be empowered about who you are. Even though you've been through challenges and, different brokenness, you can be restored and healed from that. The Weapons of the Mind, this is another mental health book, is backwards. But this book is in a lot of libraries throughout Wisconsin. It empowers people about spiritual matters, and it also empowers them about their mental health. So that's who my audience is, those who are into psychology, mental health, spiritual matters, and building their self-esteem.
Excellent, excellent. We have
Yeah.
another question. Somebody was talking about, you mentioned about coping strategies to protect
Yes.
your own mental health. Do you have any specific recommendations for people of color who might be isolated from community in general, like maybe somebody who is just isolated because of physical disabilities, or someone who is isolated from other Black individuals as a way to find community and identity recognition? For instance, one thing they're asking about specifically is somebody, a Black individual who might be adopted by white parents. What coping mechanisms would you suggest for people who find themselves without a support group or without that that identity recognition that you had in, like, finding the Black doll and finding your voice and relating with, yes, exactly.
I really would encourage people to, because we're in the virtual age, as we're even presenting this presentation, to find telehealth support groups. They have a lot of online support groups for women that are dealing with different challenges, for families. I am still in school for continued education, even though I have doctorates, but continued education is very important. Um, and in the process of me being in this season, I have been educated on different support groups. It's good to call in. There's a lot of call-in groups where you can talk to people. Narcotic Anonymous is also another one for people who struggle with, substance abuse, and they really help you through it. And also, very important, church groups. They have prayer lines you can call if you can't get out. And it's good to read a good book, play some good music. Breathing techniques is very helpful for coping with stress, coping with feeling lonely. Calling someone that you can coach you over the phone is very helpful. And having those resources in place, you have to build and you have to reach out. That's one thing you have to do. If that's the number one step. If you don't speak and reach out, then you'll feel by yourself, but you have to reach out. Writing is therapy. I really advocate that for processing stress and emotions. Writing what you feel and talking to someone about it. And if you can't get out, call them. As I said, go online and look up different online community groups. Every week they have different support groups that I've participated in as a guest and shared some things. And they're like 20 people online just connecting and supporting each other and encouraging each other that it's going to be all right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
What can you say to people who consider themselves allies to people of color, whether they're white or a different race, allies to especially discriminatory practices against Black people? How can people who want to be anti-racist help support other races in their mental health journeys?
So what you guys are doing is definitely a great advocacy platform because it gives us hope as African Americans. So thank you. Community support groups and meetings as COVID-19, the restrictions lift, because that really has put a damper on a lot of access of support.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you asked that question about what if you're at home, what do you do? And supporting Black-owned businesses. Remember you and I talked about that. Coming out and just coming to different park events, things like that shows African Americans that, okay, you guys matter. Of course, people have marathon causes, marches, peaceful protests, and I put emphasis on peaceful, no violence. Is a huge way of showing support to African Americans as advocates and, showing that you're an alliance, for the cause. And so wearing t-shirts that say, you matter. I have one that says everybody matters. I should have worn it today, but sending those kind of messages, even if you're just out going to the grocery store and you're wearing a shirt like that. And, I think those are the platforms that really helps us. I can say that as a Black woman, gives me hope. And discussing things on media, like on television sometimes, on talk shows and things like that helps.
Yeah.
So.
Tell me I know that, obviously you've faced direct discrimination. You as a Black woman, you've faced systemic racism. Tell me the impact that you feel people of color face through like a vicarious racism by the trauma. What trauma comes from watching discriminatory racist events such as violent shootings and police shootings of Black individuals? And that's not happening directly to a person, but to experiencing that for someone in your race over and over again. What do you feel happens in situations like that? And what are your suggestions for coping with things like that?
Thank you for asking that. As a wellness life coach and as a pastor, but from a life coach perspective, spiritual life coach perspective, you have to be aware, everybody needs to be aware that when you're discriminated against, it is a crisis. It may be unspoken, but it is a crisis. And a crisis is something that is making you feel uncomfortable. It's not based on what someone else thinks, it's what makes you feel distressed. And it's causing you to feel, like you feel overwhelmed. So clinically, to feel overwhelmed or to feel oppressed, which is a deeper level, it's like they call it major depression. To get into that state of mind is a crisis. And the trauma part of that is the ongoing exposure to what we see on the news of Black men being killed for no reason. And now it's happening to Black women and other races. That is trauma. And they call that clinically secondary trauma. It's not happening to you if you're not Black. But even if you are Black and it's not happening to you, if I see a Black man killed, which we have on social media, on the television throughout the past few years, that feels like you're affecting my family because I'm from that culture. And so that's considered trauma. And so to cope with that, we have to talk about it. We need to pray. We need to advocate, how to deal with law enforcement, advocate training, proper training for law enforcement, for police officers. When I was in high school, at Washington High School at 14, and when I was emerging, into my adult years, and before I really saw racism in corporate, my first job was community service aide. That was my very first job in my whole life. I didn't know I would be a community advocate later. And what I did is I worked with the police station. I worked as a community aide. I was being paid as a high school student part-time. And I worked with the police station at 7th District Police Station, to be exact. I didn't have a uniform. I just had a badge, like an ID. And they used to be like, she 5'0", y'all, she 5'0". And so I'm like, I'm not 5'0", I'm just a community aide. And they basically would take us in their undercover cars and we would go to neighborhood block meetings. And it was within the parameters of school time because your parents had to sign off on it. So I would work from like 4 to 7. And we would go to block meetings through churches and parks. One time it was a fireplace house, a firefighter house. And they were collaborating, all these different people, on getting better locks, how to deal with the police better, the police dealing with the community better, having community events that will make people feel loved and welcome. And I was exposed to that at 14 years old, from 14 to 15 years old. And I think having those programs for young people that are in high school will kind of give them the mindset of being productive and training them to, if they're interested in law enforcement, how to treat people and treat their community so that when they become officers or work in any area of law, they can stop the injustice that we're seeing.
Mhm.
I didn't become a police officer. I was offered that position. They're like, well, you can become a police aide. I'm like, no, I'm too girly. But I'm not saying that you can't be a police officer and be girly. I'm just saying, I just was like, I don't want to break my nails. I don't want to mess up my hair. But they did, Robin. They was like, well, you can be a police aide. I'm like, no. But it impacted me. And so I was even more sensitive coming into the generation I'm in now, how to treat the community. And so and I even went to the police academy. I saw how the police officers were trained at 14 years old. And so if they enforce programs like that more, and that's what I work with Micah on, I kind of advocate that. If they enforce these programs or have grants for the generation that's coming up to rebuild a new generation of officers, people who are interested in that, how to treat people and stop putting your legs on people's necks and reacting, and allow people to just put their hands up and treat them with care. If you're checking on them, don't get violent with them. I think it would resolve part of the problem.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, so I thought I'd share that. I sure was. That was my first job. I was getting paid $4.55. And at
You're
that
dating
time, that was
yourself
some
there.
good money.
Right, right. Well,
Yes,
that's interesting
yeah,
what you said about, so crisis, you're saying crisis is what's happening and trauma is
yeah,
how you're experiencing it. But
how you're experiencing it.
there's trauma that you can experience from something that's happening directly to you, and trauma that you can experience by what's happening around you.
Yeah,
And
what's happening around you is called secondary trauma.
secondary trauma.
And we
Okay.
can't forget the children because they're being affected too. And if they're not counseled, or if they're not cared for mentally, if we're not talking to them at their age level, and their the language they can understand, then they're going to grow up with all these mental health issues.
Mhm.
And as I said before, in you and I private conversation, children express their hurt and their pain through drawing, and sometimes through their playtime. And
Mhm.
so it's not just us, but we got to look at that new generation. And if they're exposed to trauma, we need to make sure they're being talked to and discussed, and they're processing those emotions through conversations and asking them, are you okay? And, tell me what you're thinking, how you're feeling. All of that is helpful to process and recover from trauma, because
Right.
nightmares is part of the trauma. That's the reaction of the crisis. I've had nightmares of the police running after me, and I'm going through the walls, and because of what I'm seeing in the world.
Right.
That's
So children are
trauma.
probably experiencing that.
Oh
And
yeah,
and children are also experiencing the trauma of their parents. I mean, because they're hearing things and they experience the trauma that they're sensing that their parents are experiencing as well. Yeah.
and
Do
I,
you
I
know?
I hate hearing sirens. Every time I hear a siren, it just I feel like I have to pause. It's because it's like a sound of danger to me.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
that's like something I process every time I hear a siren. So imagine a child, if they hear a siren, they're like alarmed. And so we have to discuss and explain to them as things is happening. This is what's happening, but you're safe. And we need that as well as adults
Right.
through support groups.
We've had
Yes.
somebody ask if you know of any local, and maybe Micah is one of them, local or national organizations that are strong advocates of mental health across different identities, but especially in regard to race. Who's doing this work out in the community?
Well, the American Suicide Association,
Mhm.
not saying that a person is suicidal, but it's important that you're aware of these organizations, the suicide hotline, because then they have other referrals that you can go to. Because we're in Milwaukee, you and I know that there's organizations like Micah, and Mental Health of America is another one. The what's the name of that place for the homeless, the Milwaukee Rescue Mission.
Mhm.
Once you go to places like that, or if you're in a different city, you have to find out where the homeless shelters are. All of those type of places, they have advocate connections to other mental health places. They're trained to.
Mhm.
And so those are different ways that you could get some support. And of course, you know, as I said before, church groups and organizations is very important as well.
Right. So you rely on your support systems. Another person has asked if you have any personal favorite books for emotional resiliency or mental health that you go back to time and time again for wisdom or for support. Anything personal to you or that you could recommend to others?
There is one called Crisis and Trauma Counseling. It's one that I recently had a class in. And the author is called, I think his name is Dr. Norman Wright. It is on Amazon and it is a little expensive. I think it's almost $100, but it's a really good book. It explains different coping techniques. And if you can hold, I can actually get a picture of it, show you guys an image of it so they would know what it looks like.
Sure.
Well, 1 second, let me get that for you guys. So this is what it looks like. It's backwards. It's called Crisis and Trauma Counseling.
Mm-hmm. It's frontwards for us. It'll show up frontwards
it
for
is?
our viewers.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Very, very, very good book. One of my favorite crisis trauma books in the world. As I said, one of my favorite. It's good for professionals, for pastoral care, for community leaders, mental health specialists, anybody that doesn't even have a title, just a regular, normal person. There's so many things that talks about the phases of crises and how to cope with it. If you're at home, breathing techniques, as I said before, sometimes they do encourage you to, you know, get medical help because sometimes it may be really severe and you know, psychiatrists will recommend certain medications. You know, that's another level, but it talks about all of that. So
Right.
highly recommend that.
That's very interesting. So
Yes.
anything you can recommend to people, like if your trauma level, if you feel like your trauma is manageable, where you don't need the support of perhaps a doctor, but you do need the support, how do you suggest people go about bringing people together around these issues? Like whether it's their family or their friends. Have you been involved in anything, in any community circles or discussion groups or ways that you can release your stress and help build that resiliency?
So definitely the church is one avenue. Another one that I've used platforms is going to the library, finding out what type of events are going on and using that as a platform. I really hugely advocate that because I'm an author and a lot of my books are in libraries as a resource for people to have book clubs and book discussions, because anytime you're talking, you're processing. And I don't think a lot of people know that, but when you're talking, you're releasing the hurt and the anger, and it's a step of healing. It's not all of the healing, but it's a step. When you internalize and you don't say anything, that's when it goes into depression because you're depressing it, and other mental health issues happen. But library events is very key. And sometimes you just have to get out and go, you know, out into the community and see what's going on. You know, it can even be through, you know, watching, you know, news reports or advertisements of things. It's also good to travel sometimes, just take a good road trip, you know what I mean? And see, yeah, like sometimes say to my husband, let's get some Italian food. I'm not Italian, but I just want to see, you know what I mean?
Yeah, so sometimes connecting right to the source of the trauma helps you
Yeah,
process it, but sometimes disconnecting, giving yourself the freedom to step away and do some self-loving kind of care.
self-care. And another organization that I'm affiliated with is Greater Milwaukee Foundation. I've done some work with them. I have a couple of YouTube videos with them. And a couple of years ago now, before COVID, they had this event downtown Milwaukee where they had diverse tables come together. They had round tables. It was amazing. And they basically had people walk in and pick out, I think there were color of beads, and whatever color bead you had to sit at that table, and you didn't know.
Wow.
Isn't that cool? And you
Yes,
did.
yes, that's the on the table or the open table.
Yeah.
I don't remember the name of the program. That should be coming up again soon. Yes,
Yes,
that's interesting.
I'm very connected to that, and
Mhm.
so my husband and I went to that. It was so fun. We sat, and you have no choice but to interact. And then sometimes going to and just discussing, hey, how do you feel it when you go in this area? And it was this one Caucasian guy. He was intrigued over what me and my husband were saying, and he was like, well, I'm kind of scared to be in the Black community. Like, how do I deal with that? And I'm like, well, exposure to it is how you deal with it. You have to get over that fear and go where there's positive things going on, whether you go on Facebook and look at Facebook events, or traveling, finding out what's going on in other states. It just helps you to be normalized, being with someone else. Like, I like being around Chinese people sometimes. If you never expose yourself to that, how would you know? Because everybody's not bad of different cultures. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Yes,
So
yes.
different environments, going to different environments is very important, but doing it within the boundaries of safety, of course. But looking on the news, well, people don't do newspapers too much no more, but hey, let's see what's going on over here. And just, putting yourself out there and, just discovering new things, I think is just a fun way.
Yeah, well, it's hard to understand another community if you only are looking at them from a distance and you're not really in the community to understand people. Yeah.
Exactly. Engaging is very important.
Yes, yes. Well, this hour has flown by. I wanted just to have you sort of, one thing that you talked about back when you first talked about being given the doll, that you saw representation and that gave you internal strength, and you said that she represented freedom and change for you. Do you have any final thoughts of your own personal freedom, your own personal strength?
This doll represents hope, and it represents just that my color, it was important to the toy industry or whoever began to make African American dolls. Instead of just focusing on one color, it showed me that, a little girl who doesn't understand racism will see value in seeing a doll that comforts her, because little girls hold dolls or stuffed animals as a friend, as a silent friend of comfort. And so that's what this doll represents to me. Of course, I'm mature. I don't play with dolls anymore, but it's like an antique for me now,
A good reminder of a personal journey and personal stories. Well, and we are already at 8 o'clock, Dr. Lewis.
Wow.
I know it went very, very fast. I appreciate you being here tonight. I hope all our viewers will join us in thanking Dr. Shon Lewis for taking time to talk with us on Tosa Talks. Thanks so much for sharing your experiences and your insights. It was a pleasure to have you here. And thank you also to our Facebook audience for your time and interest, as well as your thoughtful questions. And as always, a special thank you to our generous friends at Bostik. Their support makes the entire Tosa Talks series possible. Everyone can plan on joining us next Wednesday when we welcome members of the Metropolitan Milwaukee Fair Housing Council for a discussion on housing equity and their MKE Opportunity Program. It's really interesting. As well as on the following Thursday for a conversation about issues facing our LGBTQ community members with Brad Schleikowski from Courage Milwaukee. Remember that all the recordings of Tosa Talks can be found on the Tosa Together YouTube channel. We've got quite a library accumulating there. Reach out to us anytime through Facebook, our website, or by emailing us directly at tosatogether@gmail.com. And another good night to Dr. Shon Lewis. Thank you, Dr. Lewis.
Thank you as well.
It was
And
really
any
nice
of
to
my-
talk with you.
Thank
I'm
you.
Robin Luther, and I'm with Tosa Together, and it has been my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Shon Lewis and to be here with you as well as with all of you. Thanks for being part of the Tosa Talks and our mutual effort to build a diverse, thriving community. And with that, we'll say good night and nice to see everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks.